At my DIL request. My family excluded me from the family trip, so I took back the house. My name is Marjorie Sutton, but around this town, no one calls me that. They just say, Marge, short simple, like the kind of person I've always tried to be. All my life, I believed that if I was patient enough, loving enough, family would be the place I could lean on. But then came the days when I realized I was still living under the same roof, but somehow my heart had been left behind. I'm not telling this story to ask for pity. I just want to share what really happened in those final days when I was still holding on, still hoping. If you've ever stayed silent when you should have spoken up, if you've ever given so much of yourself that you forgot who you were, then maybe this story is meant for you too. And maybe in these quiet moments, you'll come to see what took me years to understand. Sometimes real love begins the day you stop letting others treat you like you don't matter. Sometimes people still live with their family, but no longer belong there. I stood on the porch, an old bamboo broom in hand, sweeping away layers of fallen leaves. Nothing felt different from years past. The old maple still stood silently in the corner of the yard. The wind still blew sharp and cold, slipping through the thin sweater I'd worn since last fall. But this year, the yard felt emptier, quieter. Even the sound of children's laughter seemed to have been swept away with the wind. As I bent down to pick up the little sign by the front steps, the faded "Welcome Home" that hadn't been replaced in years, I found myself wondering how long it had been since I actually felt welcome here. Just a few autumns ago, Noah and Eli would run around the yard, gathering bundles of red leaves, giggling by my side. But this year, it was just me, in a yard full of silence and leaves. I brought the sign inside, set it down by the cabinet near the doorway, an old habit tidying things up to make the house feel a little less lonely. In the kitchen, the scent of toast still lingered from breakfast. I didn't touch the loaf David had left on the table, nor the coffee Tessa had poured. Everything already felt cold, even before I had a chance to sit down. The sound of an engine starting made me turn. Through the window, I saw David and Tessa loading suitcases into the trunk. Tessa wore a long beige coat, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. David said nothing, just packed each bag quietly. Noah ran in circles, clutching his basketball. Eli was fiddling with his little blue backpack. I didn't step outside. I hadn't been asked to go. No one had mentioned me coming along. I stood there, clutching an old kitchen towel until it wrinkled in my hands, listening to Tessa remind Noah to pack a thicker jacket. Her words were soft, ordinary, but they fell like shards of glass, sharp, scattered cutting wherever I happened to step inside myself. Noah looked up, his eyes the same ash gray as David's when he was young, flicked toward the window. He smiled at me, quick, fleeting, then turned away. I lifted my hand in a small wave. So small, I wasn't even sure I'd really done it. Jean came by that afternoon. She brought a warm apple pie still fresh, the smell of cinnamon and butter drifting across the porch. We sat on the old wooden bench. I'd laid down a faded cloth, afraid the damp wood might seep into the pie. Jean took a sip of her tea, then sighed. Rockford's at its best when the leaves turn, don't you think? I nodded, eyes fixed on the front yard, the same yard where just last year I was still knitting sweaters for the kids while they played. Jean glanced sideways at me, her gaze sharp, behind thin silver frames. You going anywhere for Thanksgiving? I didn't answer right away. I looked down at my hands, thin, worn, marked with age spots. My thumb still bore the tiny scar from peeling apples the other day. I blinked once, then slowly shook my head. Jean didn't say anything else. We just sat there, listening to the wind rustle through the branches, watching the brittle, yellow leaves swirl across the yard. And for a moment I thought, maybe those leaves were a little like me, past their season, just waiting for the wind to carry them away. I never imagined Thanksgiving would be something I'd have to face alone. Forgetfulness doesn't arrive like a storm. It comes like steady rain, slow, quiet, wearing away the smallest pieces of love until nothing's left. I woke before dawn, while the mist still clung to the windows. The house was silent, save for the soft creak of a window left slightly open. I pulled my wool shawl over my shoulders and made my way to the kitchen. Cold light filtered through the sheer curtains, landing on an empty table. This used to be the warmest kitchen I ever knew. David, as a little boy, would swing his legs from the stool, nibbling on toast, while I made breakfast. The kitchen still looked the same: dark wood cabinets, the old oven, the round table, covered with a checkered cloth. But the warmth of family, it was gone. I filled the kettle and set it to boil, wondering what they might say to me today. Or, more likely, what they wouldn't say. I'd grown used to the suffocating quiet, the kind that settles between people who once shared the same blood. David and Tessa slept in. I heard their footsteps above the sound of drawers opening and closing, the kids murmuring to each other. I poured myself a small cup of tea, the steam fogging up my glasses. When I wiped them clean, David was already standing at the kitchen doorway, his eyes unreadable somewhere between distracted and uncomfortable. I nodded. He gave a faint smile, then turned away, a gesture so familiar I barely noticed it anymore. Breakfast passed in broken silence, punctuated only by the clink of silverware against porcelain. Tessa ate quickly, almost hurriedly. The children whispered and giggled, sneaking glances at their mother. I ate slowly, each bite small, careful, as if stretching out the last bit of warmth still left in this house. When I stood to wash the dishes, Tessa quietly packed the leftovers into containers. Later, she opened the fridge and saw the tray of oatmeal cookies I'd baked the night before Noah's favorite. I heard her sniff lightly, then close the fridge without a word. Noah tiptoed up to me while I was drying my hands on my apron. He looked up and whispered, "Grandma, I wish you were coming." I froze. His little voice, hesitant, tender, dropped into the dry well of my heart like a single drop of water. I smiled and patted his head, but said nothing. Sometimes, even the sweetest words don't feel safe enough to answer. After breakfast, Tessa and David went back to their plans for the trip. I could hear them from the living room, talking fast with purpose. Hotel names, flight times, rental cars, dinner reservations, every detail discussed, decided, but not once did my name come up. I sat by the window, mending an old coat, each stitch steady, patient, thread slipping in and out like the rhythm of time, passing quietly, meaninglessly. Then I heard Tessa say, firm and clear, "I already said, just our little family. No one else. No one else." I pressed my lips together, fingers tightening around the needle. The seam I'd just sewn came loose. A dangling thread slipped from the sleeve. Just like me, loose, forgotten, no longer part of this place. They planned to leave early tomorrow. A long trip, a whole week, all the way to Florida. Sunshine beaches, Disney World. And me, I wondered what I'd do in this empty house. Clean, cook, take lonely walks through leaf-covered streets. Maybe that's enough. Later that afternoon, Noah slipped into my room. He hesitated in the doorway, holding a folded piece of paper. I motioned for him to come in. He shoved the paper into my hands and quickly ran out. I unfolded it, a messy drawing of Santa Claus, riding a sleigh over a little house. Below it, in wobbly handwriting, "I'll miss you, Grandma." I folded the paper back up and tucked it into my nightstand drawer. Not because I thought it would change anything, but because I knew I'd need something, anything, to remind me that someone once remembered me. At our last dinner before the trip, we ate sandwiches and salad. Tessa reminded David to check the plane tickets. David reminded Noah to pack his video games. Eli begged for gum at the airport. No one asked if I wanted anything. No one asked if I needed anything. I finished my meal quietly and left the table before anyone else. Back in my room, I lay my head on a pillow worn soft in the middle from years of sleeping on one side. Outside the window, the wind had picked up. Maple leaves spun through the air, swirled, hovered, then fell without a sound. I closed my eyes, listening to the branches tapping against the glass. I wasn't expecting anything from tomorrow or the days after. I only hoped the silence would feel a little less heavy than it did today. And that's when I knew, to them, I no longer belonged to that little family. Sometimes letting go doesn't come from exhaustion, but from the quiet truth that we've held on too long to something that was never truly ours. I stood behind the curtain, watching in silence. David was dragging the large suitcase out the front door, shoulders hunched, his face hidden beneath the collar of his thick coat. Tessa followed behind, juggling tote bags and the kids' backpacks. Noah and Eli bounced alongside them, Noah clutching that old, worn-out basketball, the one I patched for him last summer. No one looked up at the window where I stood. No one looked back. I didn't come out to say goodbye. No one asked me to. The car doors slammed shut, sharp, final, echoing through the cold morning air. The wind howled across the yard as the black SUV rolled slowly away, tires crunching dry maple leaves into dust beneath the wheels. The yard was empty. A hollow stillness settled in my chest. No errands to run, no voices to answer. Just me and the silence. I locked the door and stepped inside. The house suddenly felt enormous. Every footstep echoed like tapping against walls, layered in memory. I passed through the living room and stopped by the dark wood cabinet near the entrance. From the bottom drawer, I pulled out an old folder, its edges frayed with age. Deeds, insurance papers, tax records, all stacked neatly in a brown plastic file. I sat down, flipping through the pages, my eyes lingering on the faded ink of a contract dated over 30 years ago. There it was, my name, Marjorie Sutton, sole owner. No co-signers, no disputes. This house, from its cracked foundation to its sun-worn roof, belonged to me. I had built it with my husband when we were young and broke, just starting out. We planted every maple tree in the yard, painted every door, built every shelf with our own hands. I ran my fingers over the paper. Its texture was rough beneath my touch, grounding, and in that moment, I clenched my hand. I didn't need to beg for a place in my own home. I didn't need to shrink under the cold stares of people who once called me mother or grandmother. I stood up, returned the folder to the drawer, locked it, and slipped the key into my coat pocket. That afternoon, I drove into town. The locksmith's shop sat at the far end of Main Street, just past the used bookstore, in the little cafe where Jean and I always shared a table on Saturdays. The shop was quiet, like the rest of Rockford in autumn. The locksmith, an older man with kind eyes, was shaping a key on the grinding machine. He looked up as I entered, squinted through his glasses, and gave a gentle smile. "Afternoon, Marge. Changing locks today," I nodded. "Front door, back door, basement, and the garden gate. I want a full set, no duplicate keys." His eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't ask why. In towns like this, people understand, without needing all the words. He brought out 4 new lock sets, lining them up neatly on the counter. "When do you want them changed? Tonight?" He nodded, wrapped the locks in a paper bag, and handed it to me. I paid in cash, a small, solid satisfaction stirring in my chest as I walked back out. At home, I laid the lock sets on the dining table, pulled out an old screwdriver from the drawer, and started with the front door. It wasn't easy. The old lock was rusted stiff. But I was patient, one screw at a time, one pull, one turn, until the old heavy lock finally gave way. A gust of wind slipped in through the open door, sharp and biting, but it didn't stop me. I slid the new lock into place. When the mechanism clicked a soft, clean sound, it felt like a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I moved on to the back door, then the basement, then the garden gate. Each time I turned the key, I felt something let go inside me, a piece of weight I'd carried for far too long. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was locking the final door. Bolt drawn, key turned, the sound crisp, certain. For the first time in years, I stood in my home and didn't feel like an intruder. The last light of the day poured through the living room window. I stood still, listening to the thick, quiet hush all around me. No arguments, no hurried footsteps, no cold glances that sliced through me. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle and brewed a cup of tea. The scent of black tea rose slowly, warm and steady, filling the air. I placed the cup gently on the table and pulled out my old, leather-bound notebook, the one where I used to jot down recipes, phone numbers, little things I didn't want to forget. On the first page, I wrote a new heading, "Things That Are Mine," and underneath, I made a list, "This house, my freedom, my memories, my dignity." I paused, took a sip of tea. It was bitter, but pleasantly so. Not like the bitterness of holidays past. This one was clean, like clarity. Outside, the wind had finally settled. The last leaves on the maple stood still. The house wrapped itself in silence, thick and complete, as if it too was exhaling after years of holding its breath. And, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to be here, alone. That night, I slept the whole way through. No dreams, no ache, just rest. The house was cold, but not lonely, just quiet, in a way that felt good, in a way that finally felt like peace. Not all doors are meant to wait for someone to knock. Some are born to be locked. I thought the house would stay quiet for at least a week, but not every flight leaves on time. The message from David came in late afternoon. Their flight was canceled due to the storm, and they were heading back. I sat in the armchair in the living room, hands folded in my lap, staring out through the thin curtain. Outside, dusk was falling fast. Faint streaks of light stretched across the rain-slicked street. The maple tree in the yard stood black and bare, like a ghost stripped by winter's early winds. The knocking came again, louder this time, more urgent. I didn't move. I sipped the cold tea in my pale blue cup, oddly calm. Through the gap in the curtain, I saw David at the door. He wore a heavy coat, a knit cap, pulled low, his shoulders hunched against the chill. Tessa stood behind him, arms crossed, a scowl tightening her face. Noah and Eli clung to her sides, their expressions confused and uncertain. I left them there. David rang the doorbell. The sharp chime rang out across the house, shattering the stillness that had finally settled. I didn't get up. I had no reason to. I watched it all like an outsider. Tessa leaned down to whisper something to Noah. He nodded hesitantly, his eyes flicking toward the window, not knowing I was there watching. David pulled out his phone. I assumed he was calling. Inside, the phone rang a sound I once waited for, once longed for. Now it rang like a voice I didn't recognize. His name flashed on the screen. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. They stayed a few minutes longer. I glanced at the clock. 6:20 p.m. The temperature must have dropped near freezing. Tessa shifted restlessly, pulling out her own phone, probably searching for nearby hotels. Finally, after a few more words with David, she turned sharply away. David looked back once more, then began dragging the suitcase back toward the car. I let the curtain fall. Inside, the quiet returned as if it had never been disturbed. I sat for a while longer, then rose and went into the kitchen. The kettle had boiled dry. Dark stains speckled the bottom of the pot. I turned off the stove and poured myself a glass of cold water. The phone buzzed again, a new voicemail. I left it. I cracked open the small kitchen window and inhaled deeply. The scent of rain and damp earth drifted in. Outside, the street lamp cast a dim, yellow glow over the old maple tree. Its twisted limbs curled like brittle fingers, clawing at the sky. I sat at the dining table. The phone vibrated again. Another voicemail. I didn't listen, but I didn't delete it either. I left it there, a quiet reminder that silence, too, is an answer. I brewed a new pot of tea, stronger this time, more leaves than usual. The scent rose, bold and warm, filling my hands as I held the cup. Seated again, I pulled my leather notebook from the drawer, flipped to the last page I'd written on, and added to the list the right to quiet. I smiled faintly. The handwriting was crooked, but firm. No one could take that from me, no matter how hard they tried. Outside, the porch light swayed gently in the wind. I closed the notebook, poured the tea, took a slow sip. Just plain black tea. No sugar, no honey. Bitter, but pleasant. Much like this feeling. Bitter, yes, but no longer sharp. As I sat there in the stillness, the phone buzzed once more. This time, I picked it up. A message from Noah. I miss you, Grandma. My heart pulled like a hairline crack, spreading across ice. But I didn't reply. Not yet. I needed time to be sure I was doing the right thing. That this wasn't just a flare of pride or hurt, but the result of everything I'd carried for far too long. I opened the voicemail. Sender Tessa. I hesitated, then pressed play. Her voice came through cold and sharp. If shutting us out makes you happy, then go ahead. Enjoy yourself. I listened to the first sentence, then deleted the message. No saving, no replaying. I got up, stepped onto the porch, and pulled the door shut behind me, locked it, turned the deadbolt, secured the latch. Outside, the sky had gone completely dark. Soft lights from other houses shimmered in the fog, faint and far. I leaned back against the door, took a deep breath. I brewed another pot of tea, lit the fireplace, and for the first time, this house truly felt like mine. Some wounds don't bleed, but they seep, quietly painfully, through the coldest winters of our lives. I sat in the living room, watching the last traces of sunlight fade across the old wooden floor. The soft glow of dusk slipped through the blinds, falling across a half-finished cup of tea. The silence was so complete, I could hear every tick of the clock on the wall. I stood and began to touch one by one the things I had held onto for far too long. Birthday gifts Tessa picked out, with no thought, family photos, with forced smiles, cheap decorations, stacked in the corners of the room. I grabbed a large trash bag. One by one, I tossed the items in without hesitation. With every piece gone, the room grew brighter, lighter. Things I once thought proved I still had a place in this family. Now, just dusty memories that no longer held weight. When I reached the old rug by the fireplace, I paused. Its edges were frayed, one corner scorched from the time Eli played too close to a candle. I had patched it once, sat for hours, needle in hand, eyes blurred with age and effort. Today, I folded it and dropped it in the bag without a second thought. Outside, Tom Delaney sat on the bench in front of his porch, holding a paper coffee cup. He glanced over our eyes, meeting through the window. I opened it slightly and leaned out. "Evening, Tom," I called softly. He nodded and gave a small smile, his eyes narrowing kindly. "Cleaning house?" he asked. "Yes," I said, giving it back to myself. He took a sip, then said in that low, steady voice of his, "No one needs to stay where they're not appreciated." I didn't answer. His words drifted through the cold air and settled into my chest like a thin, sharp blade. But I didn't argue. There was nothing left to deny. I dragged the trash bag out and loaded it into the back of my old pickup. The drive to the dump took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like I was unloading an entire chapter of my life. When I returned home, I pulled out the old folder from the drawer. The papers had yellowed, but the ink was still clear. I took it to the law office. Jean once recommended a small white house by the lake, a wooden sign creaking gently above the door. The lawyer was a man in his 50s, gold-rimmed glasses, calm eyes. I sat down across from him and slid the folder across the desk. "I'd like to update my will," I said, my tone no different than if I were choosing flower seeds for spring. He nodded and opened the folder. I pointed to the inheritance section. "Noah," only I said. "The house, the savings, everything." He glanced up at me, brows furrowed slightly, but he didn't ask why. He just made his notes and nodded. When I stepped out of that office, the papers tucked safely in my bag, I felt lighter, like I'd finally stopped leaning into a wind that had pushed back for years, like I had let go of something that was never mine to carry. That evening, I sat by the fireplace, flipping through old pages in my leather-bound notebook. I found a blank one and wrote, "Memories can't make people stay, but we keep them to remind ourselves never to forget the lesson." I closed the notebook and placed it on the bookshelf. My phone lit up a new message. "Noah, I miss you, Grandma." I read it once, then again and again. Finally, I set the phone down, brewed myself a cup of hot cocoa, thick, bittersweet. That night, I didn't go to bed right away. I sat by the fire watching the flames flicker. The house was quiet, warm in its own way. No hollow laughter, no forced conversation, just peace. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch broom in hand, sweeping the last of the fallen maple leaves. And then I saw him. Noah stood at the gate, wearing his thick coat knit cap pulled low, in his hands a box of cookies. He looked shy, unsure, but his eyes lit up when they found mine, and in that moment I wondered maybe this is what's left after the storm. The next morning, at my doorstep, Noah stood there holding a box of cookies and eyes full of longing. Some meals are meant for one, yet feel warmer than any crowded table missing kindness. I stood quietly on the porch, watching Noah clutch the cookie box tight in his hands. There was something in his eyes, hesitant, soft, something he didn't know how to say. I slowly unlatched the gate. No rush, no words, just one small step back to let him in. We sat in the living room. The firelight flickered against the walls, casting soft shadows across the ceiling. Noah placed the box on the table, rubbing his hands together for warmth. I slid a cup of tea toward him, but he shook his head. "I'm sorry," he whispered, eyes fixed on the wooden grain of the table. "For everything." I shook my head and smiled faintly. "You don't have to be Noah." The silence between us thickened like the fog that clung to the yard outside. I didn't rush him, didn't press. Some things take root slowly, like the maple tree out front, still budding come spring, no matter how long the winter lasts. I slipped into the kitchen and quietly prepared dinner. A small chicken I had already thawed, roasted with dry rosemary. A slice of leftover pumpkin pie, its cinnamon scent still gentle and warm. Nothing fancy, just the small table set for two mismatched silverware, two old porcelain plates chipped at the edge. By the time I brought the food out, Noah was already seated, hands folded in his lap. We ate in silence. No small talk, no polite pretending. Just the clink of silverware on porcelain, the whisper of wind against the windows, the occasional pop of firewood from the hearth. After the meal, Noah pulled a card from his backpack, the front covered in crayon scribbles. "I made this for you," he said, placing it gently on the table in front of me. I opened it. Inside, just 4 words, crooked, slanted, but steady. "Thank you for staying." I folded the card and placed it beside my now cold cup of tea. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Some gratitude doesn't need to be answered aloud. The phone buzzed on the table. David's name flashed on the screen. I didn't pick up. Noah glanced at me unsure. I reached out, rested my hand over his, and gave a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to worry about me," I said. "I'm okay. And you will be too." He nodded, eyes red. I rose and walked into the bedroom. From the drawer, I took out an old book, a worn poetry collection I had kept since girlhood. Tucked between its pages was the letter I'd written the night before. I handed the book to Noah. "One day," I said, "you'll understand." He took it without question, held it close to his chest, like it was the most precious thing he'd ever been given. Outside, the sky had gone dark. The porch light cast long shadows as we stood by the gate. I watched as Noah climbed into his father's car. No one said goodbye, but before the car pulled away, he looked back just once. I stood in the doorway, my hand resting on the cold wooden frame. Inside me, there was still a hollow space, but it no longer ached. I turned back in, locked the door, cleared the dishes, wiped the table, folded the cloth neatly, the way I always did a quiet ritual to end the day. I poured a fresh cup of tea, carried it to the bedroom. The soft yellow glow of the old lamp warmed the room. I settled into the armchair by the window blanket draped over my legs. Outside, the maple tree still stood bare, quiet, but strong, in the face of winter. The phone lit up once more. A message from David. What are you planning to do, Mom? I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. I left it there, a quiet reminder that I had already made my choice. I locked the screen and looked out the window. Fog had blanketed the street. The street lights blurred into soft golden smudges, like lost stars in a sea of white. I expected nothing from the other side. Not anymore. When Noah left, I stood in the doorway, watching that little car disappear into the cold mist. But inside me, it wasn't cold anymore. There are nights when you realize the quiet inside an empty house isn't loneliness. It's simply what remains after the noise has gone. I used to believe that sacrifice meant love. But now I understand, if you don't learn to cherish yourself, even those closest to you can turn away. Like an old quilt that once kept everyone warm through winter. But once no one feels cold anymore, they forget how many times they leaned on it for comfort. If this story touched something in you, maybe today is the moment to quietly look back at all that you've given and at the way you've cared for yourself or forgotten to.